I welcome Aparna, Smita, and Puja, a very, very esteemed panel. In a day and age of manuals, in a day and age of, this is the feminist version of child rights that we often speak about at Protsahan. A little bit of context setting, and then I pass the mic to Smita, Puja, Smita, and Aparna in that order. And then Aparna, if I can request you towards the end to conclude the entire conversation of the panel as well. Why this panel? It was very important for us at Protsahan. It's been 15 years now that we've been looking at building this narrative. Of course, there's a lot of direct work on the ground that happened, but also building this narrative of a feminist future of child rights in the country. At a time and age, and there's no point shying away from the fact that Brian spoke about the South Australia or the Australian government, and it's pretty much the same way here. There is maybe some debate on children's issues in the country, in the parliament. Maybe 3 questions in a year in the Lok Sabha pertain to the questions or issues that deal with children or child rights in the country. But out of the thousands and thousands of questions and accusations that oftentimes go out there in the parliament, 3 or 4 questions in a year do make it, which are about children. Why we put together this panel was also to make sure when we are saying trauma-informed institutions, Puja heads cry, right? Smita has covered, I think, foreign ministers of every, I don't know which country is left. And Aparna, of course, has been a part of some incredible institutions. With or without institutions, I think she's a force to reckon with in her own self. But they all speak the same language, which is a feminist version of child rights. How that translates into institutional building is what Puja will start off the conversation with. Of course, with all the other pieces, Puja, that you would want to spotlight, one of the questions that बहुत सारे young छोटे-छोटे संस्थाएं founders हैं कमरे में, Himanshu is looking at us, some incredible work that this young man has been able to do to set up an entire child protection network, something that we are beginning to understand in the 13th, 14th, 15th year of Protsahan, why the network is important. Sandhya spoke about the IACN network in the morning. Himanshu has done it as the first thing, even before he started officially registered his organization, that was to build a network and a cadre of childcare professionals in the country, child protection professionals in the country. And there'll be more than, I don't know, thousands of people on that group by now. हम थोड़ा सा लड़ते हैं, झगड़ते हैं, पर बहुत मोहब्बत से issues solve करते हैं उस group में. We talk about issues that pertain to the children. But how oftentimes do we know what it takes to run an institution that focuses on child rights? And I'll quickly pass the mic on to Puja, what it takes to run an institution and to set the larger public discourse for child rights in the country.
Thank you, Sonal. Always too kind. We are about 45 years old. Not many people, I find not enough people know that we are very much an Indian organization born with 50 rupees. Our founders were very middle class, and we never have had any single large donor. The money has been raised from Indians, for Indians. But most importantly, why am I telling you why I raised the money, right? We raised the money so that we could have, I think, the freedom to create work that was centered on the child, work that could change and did change by how the environment changed. And that you had the freedom to say, this doesn't work, to admit that this doesn't work, and you move on, right? And you're saying, no, what I've understood that for the first 15 years we worked only with children, we understood it was not working. And we had to sort of figure out why was it not working. That if we were not to involve stakeholders, if we were to not build networks and movements, nothing would change. So we went out there, we created and helped create, I wouldn't say created, but helped create movements like the child campaign against child labor, then looked at, firework campaigns, etc. But actually looked at these things as not doing direct work, but looking at how children were being traumatized and how you could bring in those learnings back into the institution. I think For me, in many cases, the focus of the institution was on the child. And it was also on the invisibility of being a funder or an intermediary, because we used to fund very small organizations. How do we become invisible in that idea, right? Because if it is the child's right, then the restoration of that right is our duty, right? Our as an every adult's duty. And this should be invisible. How do you create that invisibility at the NGO level, right? So the only person real to that child should be the caregiver, should be the didi, should be whoever it is who's holding that community together. And as we progress this thought, what we realized as an institution was to say, if we place the child at the center, how do we capacitate all the duty bearers? How do we work with parents to create work that makes them parents? You know, that we tend to, in human rights work, tend to focus on parents as activists. We want to turn them into, okay, you know, you become a CBO that goes and ensures that the school is in place, or that the nurse is coming, or that the vaccinations are happening. Yes, great. Communities are supposed to do that. But what about their role as parents, as duty bearers? How do they know more about that? And we realized that we had to parallelly do it with building agency for children. So our journey brought us to building agency for children, which brought us to trauma for children. In the late 90s, we built the first quality institutional care and alternative networks across the country, bringing in every stakeholder. Because we realized that child care was just becoming about the CCIs, right? And remember, before that, even private was completely allowed. There was no regulation. Once children disappeared into so-called NGO homes or private homes, or, you know, you could get up in the morning and say, oh, the milk of human kindness is coming out of my heart. I'm going to start a home. Go out into the neighborhood, pick up 10 children from the neighboring slum and start a home. And nothing, and nobody regulated you. So for helping to create those policy frameworks, we realized became our duty, right? And then once you did that, how do you ensure that those frameworks are working? Because it's scary to not have control, right? As long as this was my home, or I was funding it, or I was controlling it, I can put the best conditions, SOPs, but how do I ensure that policy has it? How do I ensure that the people who are supposed to regulate the homes are doing their jobs? So, you know, you have to bring in the judiciary, you have to bring in high court controlled or set up processes to ensure that the CCIs are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Because until we do that, until we get this entire system working for children, you know, you and I can rescue children. And sometimes I know people who tell me, I know that my neighbor is abusing their child, their own child. They're hitting them because they believe that, you know, spare the rod, etc., etc. But I'm so scared of the childcare system that I think, you know, why should I interfere? Because this kid is going to go into a worse situation. So what I think our realization as an institution has been that the work has to happen at so many levels. We have to fix the system. We have to fix ourselves. And therefore, for CRY as an institution, my realization, Sonal, was really that if we don't acknowledge that change will have to happen with myself, with society, and with the system. And unless I can get to all three, I am not going to make permanent change. And why was the realization of the self path so difficult and so significant? Because I realized that we were sending out unhealed people to heal children, to heal communities who are suffering from deep casteism, from deep stigma of the kind that comes from, for example, to the denotified tribes. So unless my people are helped, or are willing to even look inside at their own prejudices, they're going to go out and transfer those, right? We're going to go out and transfer saying, like we've heard from school teachers who say, chamar ke bacche ho, chamar raho. Sorry to use bad language, I should apologize, because this is the ultimate insult, according to me, in this country is caste, right? And saying ki, tum school hi kyun aate ho? And the teacher is telling you this, right? So this work of actually transforming selves. And so we brought it into CRY, into building the institution. You are not allowed to be a leader at CRY if you are not willing to look at yourself. If you only want to externalize everything, everything else is bad, everybody else needs training. I don't need to look at my own prejudices. I don't need to understand where I am. We've realized that, and that's been a complicated route, frankly, because sometimes people ask me, why do you interfere with this stuff, right? It's complex. People are carrying trauma, people are carrying abuse. Sometimes we lose people because they realize they have another path. And to my mind, it's okay. If we're going to build a trauma-informed institution, as Sonal calls it, I didn't even know it was called trauma-informed, frankly. My whole concept was that we have to change ourselves and at every level train our people and constantly make them look at these mirrors. So we've implemented trauma-informed care, trainings for our field facilitators, for reminding them, giving them more and more tools, so at least they can provide the first aid. But of course, as I'm sure all of you know, we all struggle with when they need really specialized help, there isn't any.
I'll just add that little piece, Puja. Do we have a minute for Puja? Puja, do we have a minute for Puja? Yes, we do. Okay, time is up. Can I take 1 minute and use my power here? Okay. जो आपने बात करी पूजा about people will leave and it's okay to let them go, and especially if you're building a trauma-informed institution. हम सुबह से बात कर रहे हैं, हमने चिंटू और गोविंद, if I use the characters, हमने बात करी कि social workers भी, हम as social workers हमें बहुत पसंद है validation. अरे वो बच्चा हमसे कितना अच्छे से बात करता है. हम अक्सर भूल जाते हैं कि हमारी जो अनमेट इमोशनल नीड्स हैं वो हम बच्चे से निकलवा रहे हैं, वो वैलिडेशन अक्सर, राइट? एंड आई हैव सीन दिस अक्रॉस इंस्टीट्यूशंस दैट आई हैव ट्रेन्ड इन द लास्ट 15-18 years. सोशल वर्कर्स का काम बच्चे से मोहब्बत करना नहीं है, बिकॉज यू विल एंड अप मेकिंग द चाइल्ड डिपेंडेंट ऑन यू. यू आर अ पार्ट ऑफ द सिस्टम. And what I love about Puja's way of building CRY in the last 30 plus years, or 45, 33, is ये जो बात कर रहे थे about trauma-informed systems and policies, she weaves it into the HR policies. She weaves it into the trainings. And of course, out of 100, 20 will not like it, because their understanding of work is, it's too, when you're looking at a system, पुलीना से हम बात कर रहे थे सुबह, it's a different, it's not right or wrong, but there is an evolution that the younger social entrepreneurs sitting in this room who work with children will see, if not now, maybe in 20 years time or in 10 years time, that we've been doers all our life. हमें अपने आप बैठ के reflect करना भी नहीं आता है. If we are given time to reflect in a training, we go all crazy, the ants in an ant hill, like, as if the ant hill has been broken down, and because our own such deep scars and unmet emotional needs come up in that reflection time. I have faced resistance. We have faced resistance, that is not I. We have faced resistance when we're like, यार ये क्या reflection ground पे जाके काम करने दो, हम 4 बच्चों को बचा लेंगे आज. And then we go like, hang on. And leadership of this work will take it for a fact, take it granted, that it will make you have, what Aparna says it beautifully that morning, that you have to learn to make people disappointed if it's leadership. If you're trying to build a trauma-informed care institution, people will go, let them go. because you're here to build the system, not cater or mollycoddle to the needs of their one or two, because system builders or institutional builders of this work, as depth of scale we do realize there is an ecosystem that we have to build a narrative for. So with that,
the real challenge I think that as social workers we face is the reality that we came here to transfer power, not to take it. And it's so easy to take it because you can be my बाप so easily, right? अरे दीदी को सब कुछ आता है, दीदी स्कूल चलवा देगी, but if you are focused on transferring power to the community, to say हमने स्कूल चलवाया, and it means you may make yourself redundant, scary, no?
yeah.
So I think that whole construct of I've seen that when people come in, that orientation of playing God to saying, can I help people find that powerful creature within themselves? And that I think is the real paradigm shift. And the scariest one for people is children. The number of people who fight with you saying, what is this agency? Children are stupid. If I tell a 5-year-old, do you want to go to school? She'll say, no, na. I need to force her. The concept of evolving capacities of children, of allowing what I call the we, right? This is what parenting or caregiving should be. That person has to be capable of making their own decisions miraculously at 18. If you keep taking their decisions for them, what are you doing? So I think just that transfer of power to communities and then to children is really our challenge, I think.
Transfer of power is a topic that Aparna would love to delve into. But we'll quickly move to Smita. Puja, keep showing me the time ups because I'm very bad at this. Smita.
Me too, clearly.
Smita, I've known you through the Australia-India Youth Dialogue. Brian is here. We were in the same cohort. And I think not a lot of times we see journalists who talk about things the way you do, who are so empathetic to the issues that they cover, not just what they cover, but how they cover. My larger question to you, Smita, is the Indian media, even question बोलते वक्त मुझे ऐसा लग रहा है कि मैं क्या ही पूछ रही हूँ, but is the Indian media trauma informed? Are there 1 or 2 or 3 or half best practices that you've seen, or there are pieces that we need to do better at?
Very esteemed fellow panelists, and thanks for the kind words, Sonal. I mean, I always tell, because I also teach in a public policy school and I teach journalism students, and I always tell them that the most important thing for you, if you really want to be a journalist, a good journalist who can win trust of people, because trust is key for somebody to be able to tell you their stories and have faith in you, is to have empathy and sympathy and be a good human being, to be a good storyteller. So that's how you get to your content. So a lot of it actually comes from individual drive and individual voice of conscience, not necessarily a collective newsroom structure, as it were. Now, to your question of Indian media, I think हम लोगों को यहाँ याद रखने की ज़रूरत है कि जब हम इंडियन मीडिया या मीडिया की बात करते हैं, आमतौर पर लोगों के दिमाग में आता है टेलीविज़न, और टेलीविज़न न्यूज़ के साथ मैंने तो बहुत लंबा वक्त गुजारा है. इंडिया टुडे, आज तक, IBN 7, CNN, IBN सबके साथ एज फॉरेन पॉलिसी एडिटर. 21 साल के करियर में 19 साल तो मैंने सिर्फ और सिर्फ टीवी को दिए हैं. लेकिन टीवी इज़ नॉट मीडिया, टीवी अलोन इज़ नॉट मीडिया. तो मुझे लगता है कि हमें थोड़ा सा ये याद रखना चाहिए कि जब हम मीडिया की बात कर रहे हैं तो हम प्रिंट की भी बात कर रहे हैं, हम रेडियो की बात कर रहे हैं, आज की तारीख में हम न्यू एज डिजिटल मीडिया की बात कर रहे हैं. सो नॉट ऑल इज़ डार्क, नॉट ऑल इज़ डार्क. टीवी देखेंगे तो फिर तो दिल करता है कि धरती फट जाए, मैं अंदर चली जाऊँ, कुछ करने को है नहीं, क्यों बर्बाद कर रही हूँ अपनी ज़िंदगी में ये डिबेट्स देख कर. एंड वेदर इट्स अ मंदिर मस्जिद डिबेट, वेदर इट्स अ डिबेट अबाउट फेमिनिज्म, वेदर इट्स अ डिबेट अबाउट सेक्शुअल असॉल्ट, TV just knows how to scrape the bottom of the barrel in the current circumstances. Unfortunately, the decline has really been sharp over the last couple of years. But let me just come to the topic of trauma, and I'll give you some instances also. Because I think what we need to constantly look for as journalists, आज हम ये women panel में हैं, मेरे लिए तो 21 साल की लड़ाई में it has been a major struggle to ensure that wherever I have anchored, where I have done shows, my channel has made sure that there has been enough women representation to begin with, to try and actually call up think tanks, NGOs, academics to find informed voices जिनको मैं अपने shows पे जोड़ सकूं. वो drive ही missing है newsroom से, more than most of the time. Even women anchors half the time actually don't even make that effort of trying to get another informed women voices to speak to. Unless, of course, it's a case of rape where suddenly you will see 5 women actually sitting and talking about it. But then, it then becomes a chamber, an echo chamber, where you're not actually getting in all the stakeholders involved to talk about it. I was just in Manipur, in fact, last week, and I'd gone there last year also to cover the conflict. It's been more than 18 months. You hardly hear the discourse of Manipur on primetime television, which has the reach. And Manipur mein is waqt ek fresh spate of violence hua hai. So if you look at what is happening in Jiribam, which is bordering Assam, 200 kilometers from Imphal, people are talking about this horrendous incident of a relief camp, which is the Methi relief camp, from where a family of 6 were abducted. Jisme ek 8 saal ki bachchi, there's a 3-year-old child, there's an infant and 3 grown-up women who were all abducted, and the autopsy details are horrendous. There have been multiple sexual assaults, eyes gouged out, burned to death. People are, and of course, the cookies are being blamed for this. What people are also not talking about is that the entire spate triggered off by a similar abduction of a cookie woman in the area, allegedly by Methis, who was also again burned, sexually assaulted, eyes gouged out. So when you're talking about the cycle of violence in a state which is so fragile, जिसमें आपकी ethnic और geographic जो separation है वो इतनी पूरी हो गई है कि इम्फाल वैली क्षेत्र में Methis हैं, they can't go to the hill region. Hill region में जो cookies हैं, they can't come to your Methi region. वहाँ पे media भी divided है. It's not just politics. So even for media today, they are not being able to give well-informed context to anything that is happening, because a Methi journalist on the ground is not being able to have a first-hand information or a look into what's happening into the cookie territory. And a lot of the journalists are allowing, unfortunately, their ethnic biases to actually color the prism of the way the stories are being told. So, when you look at all of these cases, jo sexual assault cases hai, when it deals with adults, but the impact of it that leads to the family, but that it leads for the child who has either been orphaned, or the child जिसकी सुरक्षा को लेकर इतने सवाल खड़े हो रहे हैं कि this could happen to an 8-year-old kid in a relief camp, is my child safe? What happens to this child? Some of the children, where occasionally if there is an internet connection, are being able to read these stories. It's not like they're totally cocooned off from these stories. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that, there has to be that attempt in trying to look at the root of the story without the selective biases of what community you're coming from, or just because you're a woman, so you need to be really sympathetic to the cause of the women, or because you have a child. A lot of time a normal reaction is मेरे भी 2 बच्चे हैं, मैं समझ सकता हूँ उस पे क्या हो रहा है. आप ये सोचिए कि अगर किसी के बच्चे नहीं हैं, उनको भी ये समझना चाहिए कि किसी और के बच्चे के साथ क्या हो रहा है. Just because you are a parent, it doesn't mean that it is only your onus to understand that story. So उस story telling को करने के लिए आज की तारीख में I think the work is happening in newsrooms. Say for instance, Jyoti Yadav of The Print, she did in 2022 a 3-part investigative series जिसमें she went back and looked at 3 sets of very serious sexual assault gang rape cases. 1972, there was a case which was called the Mathura case in Gadchiroli in Maharashtra, and उस औरत को तो आज तक justice मिला नहीं, लेकिन उस औरत की वजह से there were actually changes made to the CRPF Act जिसमें the onus of proving the guilt was shifted. Basically it shifted from the victim. The victim didn't have to prove the guilt. Or introduction of POCSO and things like that happened. The 1992 Ajmer case, again Jyoti went and reported on that. और उसके 32 साल बाद that case actually finally reached a conclusion where a woman got justice, a victim of gang rape actually got justice, where 6 accused men were convicted. And in that case, if you see the local daily, which was Dainik Navjyoti, that newspaper had actually completely spent its entire struggle, its entire life into investigating this case. So I think it's important when you also do follow-ups of these kind of reports, which you saw with the print doing in a 3-part series, because काफ़ी दफ़ा हमारे collective memory से ये बातें निकल जाती हैं. और हमें ये याद रखना बहुत ज़रूरी होता है कि जब इस तरह की वाक़ये होते हैं, वारदातें होती हैं, तो एक इंसान जिस सिस्टम से लड़ रहा होता है, कितने मल्टीपल लेयर्स ऑफ चुनौतियों से होकर गुजरा है. वो औरतें आज भी जब जर्नलिस्ट से बात कर रही हैं, वो नहीं चाह रही हैं कि उनके घर वालों को पता चले उनकी उस पीछे की आइडेंटिटी के बारे में, बिकॉज दे हैव ट्राइड टू कीप इट अवे. Those women are not trying to, they're not even sure कि अगर उनके लड़कों को पता चल जाए कि उनकी माँ के साथ गैंग रेप हुआ था, क्या will those sons still be with her in that family or not? So, you know, if that is happening, you also have the case of, I have a namesake photojournalist who's also called Smita Sharma. She's documented the entire cases of sexual abuse, both in children and adults, over a period of 7 years of work through a book which through photos put the spotlight on the human trafficking network and what abuse also does to people. I think alternate space mein there is work happening. Digital space mein there is work happening. You do have mainstream media ke newspapers where there is still work happening. Newsrooms में वो जोर नहीं दिया जाता है कि आप किस तरह के लैंग्वेज का इस्तेमाल करें. More often than not, unfortunately, जो political victim shaming हम देखते हैं, या बच्चों से बात कैसे करें, वो भी नहीं सिखाई जाती है. When you go into a relief camp and talk to children, there is always that conflict within us as a reporter, कि how much do you dig into that child? Do you make that child recall what that child has gone through and suffer that trauma all over again? But if you don't do that, how do you also bring out then what actually happened, which actually may be a documentation going forward in the process of a struggle for justice? तो वो जो कश्मकश है हम लोगों का, वो काफ़ी लोगों में, काफ़ी जर्नलिस्ट में नहीं होती है, that sensitivity. They will go in straight, like they tend to shove a mic, they will tend to shove a mic to the kid also and ask a question or two. How do you do that? वो training नहीं होती है हमारे newsrooms में. वो it is all what you learn on the job. It is all what you try and look within and learn within with your own responsibilities. So I think that's an area where, you know, if you look at an organization like the News Minute, which is led by somebody like Dhania Rajendran, who are constantly talking about women's rights, who are talking about feminism, who are talking about sexual abuse in a very sensitive, nuanced way. Every time they do a report, whether it's adults, whether it's children, who are also trying to focus कि किस तरह की भाषा का इस्तेमाल होना चाहिए, because language is such an important construct. You know, what you are saying about a certain case. So I think overall, Sonal, just to end it up, there are certain cases where people have done some solid reporting here on the issues, but हमारी cycle, हम लोगों की resources limited होती हैं. हम एक स्टोरी से दूसरे स्टोरी में इतने जल्दी मूव ऑन कर जाते हैं कि हमारी पर्सनल ट्रॉमा के बारे में सोचने का तो हमारे पास वक्त ही नहीं होता है. You essentially box away your traumas to forget and move on, because you're moving on from one hostage crisis to one conflict story to one natural disaster where you're constantly facing deaths and destructions that you're talking about and you're seeing. And then when day in and day out people who are reporting on Gaza, people who are reporting on Syria now, you know, or Afghanistan, look at what's happening to children and women there. You may not be on ground talking about them, you may be talking about them from a distance. They do take an impact, but unfortunately, Indian media may, I think, if you look at television in particular, it doesn't have that level of maturity that, you know, one would ideally want to have.
Thanks, Smita. You speak about the war zone, the conflict hit areas, and I'm reminded of ये हमने पिछले हृदय dialogues में भी ये story share की थी. We shared the story in the last Hriday dialogues as well, and we got an email at the peak of I think it was about 50 days into the Ukraine war, Ukraine-Russia war. And we got an email from a bunch of volunteers, just like you have the Teach for India volunteers, Gandhi volunteers here, pretty much in a similar way. We had the young 19, 18, 20, 22-year-olds in Ukraine who were working with refugee children. And we got a cold email on our info ID, you know, that info ID that sometimes you also lose track of, right, administratively. And that email said that all that you guys are doing with arts, you know, can you help us take it into the refugee camps where we are working with young children who are facing trauma, There is a specific case of scores and scores, some 40, 80 kids. In that email they explained about the butterfly bombs. It's so funny. Everybody was putting those butterflies, and in my head, you speak about that little pieces that we box away. So Russia ne kya kiya tha? They had these little neon colored bombs in the shape of butterflies, so they look like toys. And through the helicopters and through the planes and through the war machinery, they had kind of spread them through the fields. And these children who were like leaving their homes with airstrikes, with all the crazy stuff that was happening, these children would get all fit, they'd get excited with that because they have not played, they have not eaten, they have not slept. They're hallucinating in different, little ways. And they would see these shiny little objects that looked like butterflies, so they will pick it up and they will fidget with it. And the moment they fidget with it, this blows off, it blasts off. And I was thinking how wars make us so creative, in all the funny, ironic ways that I can think of. And you were speaking about some of these stories, and it just came to me. And it's
and in so many places, the kind of things that you are doing, they're not even reaching. Again, I'll go back to Manipur, very quick example. If you go to the children of conflict, anywhere, Kashmir, Manipur, it's amazing to see their natural attraction towards guns, for instance. आप बच्चों में जो toys as guns की आप attraction देखते हैं, that is so much higher. Children में, we don't even talk about, of course, adults में तो दिक्कत हो ही रही है, relief camps में, they're not even getting access to menstrual hygiene, to sanitary napkins. But for that young kid who has been displaced, whose house has been burnt down, whose parents have been forced to displace, pack their life in one suitcase, move overnight, that kid who last year was celebrating a birthday with 10, 12 friends, who were from mixed communities, Metis and Cookies, who now in a relief camp is basically stuck a happy birthday post sticker on that relief camp. And that child who is 6, 7, 8 years old, when I asked that child, do you still have Meti friends? Do you still have Cookie friends? Will you be able to be friends with your old friends? The answer is a resilient no. So I think even these things के बारे में we don't think. We are looking at the quick solutions. We are looking at कि अच्छा अभी political solution क्या हो जाए, reconciliation कैसे हो. But जो ये child trauma है, जिसने इस तरह के violence को देखा है, वो आगे जाके as a human being with another human being from a warring community किस तरह से reconcile करेगा, उसके बारे में तो हम सोचते भी नहीं हैं. That is how entire generations of hatred are born. That is how entire generations of cycles of violence are born.
And I think exactly this point Sharmila and Polina made in the morning as well, that trauma takes time. Systems probably don't have the time. Can you and me and philanthropy then, Aparna, make that time? No pressure, but can philanthropy make that time in trust-based philanthropy, in longer-term programs? Is the philanthropy trauma-informed?
Thank you, Sonal, first of all, for inviting me here. I wish we had a lot more funders in this room for us to really have an engaged dialogue. But in the absence of that sort of in our audience, but what I thought I would do is, first of all, begin with thanking all of you for the work that you do, right? And honoring the effort that you put in for your personal transformation and what you invest in the work that you do as social workers at the individual level of transformation. And because in a sense, Sonal, when you asked me to speak about the transformation that has to happen at the level of a philanthropy, right, which is about as distant as you can get from the ground of where actually change needs to happen. The transformation at the level of the child who struggles, right, who faces the trauma, and the caregivers and the duty bearers who have to respond, right? So what I thought I would do is just help us to step back a little, and I'm going to talk about 4 different steps that I think that we can reflect upon, and I will just use philanthropy as a trope for power, right? And power, let's think about power in as three different animals that are roaming about in this room, you know. One is power over resources. The second is power over systems. And the third is power over narratives, right? So philanthropy holds a certain degree of power in all of these three different spaces, but so do several other actors within the system. Governments do, policies do, individuals do, larger organizations like Cry would, right? So power over resources, systems, and narratives is held in different places and spaces, and in different locations. So while we can characterize philanthropy based on how it works, right? Is it a strategic philanthropy? Is it a trust-based philanthropy? Should philanthropy drive outcomes? Should it invest in processes? These are all questions that fundamentally actually what they're shaped by are, again, the framework within which transformation has to happen, right? Which connects back to what Puja was saying, is that all change has to happen at the level of the self, society, and system. And often when philanthropy acts, it's actually it's not thinking in that framework, right? Because there are resources which generally in the framing of a strategy are just being directed towards an outcome. So even if it is trust-based philanthropy, right, unless philanthropy builds the muscle for reflexivity, right, it doesn't start thinking about how to share power, right? And so the definition of what power I hold, if I sit as a philanthropy professional within an organization, or as, you know, someone who heads a very large civil society organization that might hold power over other forms of resources, like how the narrative gets shaped. So I think it's important not just think about power only in terms of funding, right? So power in narrative building, power in how research is shaped. You know, who are the sort of subjects of your research? Like we all know, for example, that there's a lot more research on men's health than there is on women's health. You know, why has it taken us so many decades to get the kind of... Sure, is this okay now? Is that better?
It's just natural, we tend to move a little.
Sure. All right. Is this better? Okay. Thank you. So I think it's important for us to have an analysis of how power functions, for us to actually unpack how resources get distributed. And then to have a deeper understanding of what resources are that we're talking about, right? We often think about resources only as funding, right? So unless we really start thinking about resources differently, with the lens of power, I think it becomes very difficult for us, those of us who are working on the ground and acting, to engage in productive conversations with philanthropy and not just get trapped in this thing about, is a strategic philanthropy more effective than a trust-based philanthropy or a participatory philanthropy? I think what we need to really start centering is a language around power analysis, around resources, and how we share that. The second is, I think, you know, we all tend to get quite caught up in this thing around, you know, as the science grows, practice should shift. And I'm sure that, you know, whatever we've heard today, and I've been here in the second half of the day, and I've heard a lot about how the science has really changed our understanding of trauma. How should philanthropy respond to that? Very often what happens is then you say that, okay, show me the science. And then you invisibilize the lived experience, right? So I think we have to start rethinking frameworks around what lends legitimacy to quote-unquote theories of change. So that again becomes another ground on renegotiating power. The power in narrative building, right? How do you I've heard so much of that today, right? Visibilizing the invisible. Visibilizing the invisible, I think funders do have a really important role to play, because generally when funders speak, people listen. And often funders don't speak, right? And when they do speak, they use the power of what lends them legitimacy, which is the science.
The good kind of funders are also so apologetic about that power they could wield, which is the other end of that spectrum.
Right. So I think there needs to be a lot more dialogue around that piece. The second is, I think, how resources get shared has to be around how you imagine innovation. And I think funders have a significant role to play there. For example, one of the things that, when I was in a funding organization that we had thought about was Indian Sign Language didn't have sufficient signing around sexuality and communicating issues around abuse. So there was a role that as a funder you could really think about engaging the community and saying, how can we improve signing around that, right? So language is not just about semantics, it's also about power, again, right? It's not just about what I can communicate, but how empowered do I become when I can say this? It's like the word lotus, right, that somebody referred to earlier. Again, is it a form of invisibilization? And if a child who is hearing impaired can communicate, you have empowered them to communicate. So it is really, again, language also becomes about power. Arts-based approaches, very difficult to fund because they can't be measured, right? But there is evidence that funding around arts-based approaches is central to deep shifts in healing, both at the individual and interpersonal and community level. How do you do community level healing without an arts-based approach? Good question to ask a funder, right? The third piece is around evidence and evaluation. Huge framework in the way that both funders, governments, regulators exercise power. It's show me the evidence and what is your evaluation framework going to be. And a lot of narrative change work depends on how you frame evidence and how you evaluate. There's been a large obsession with what works. There's a what works movement that's happening right now, right? Very little invested in why it works. So I think dialogues like Hriday dialogues, today I think what we've heard through the day has been on why change happens, not just what works. Because unless you know why, you can't make change happen at scale. Shifting at scale doesn't depend on what works, but on why the change is happening. So fundamental systemic shifts. So as you start to really unpack the methodological rigor of your work, you can actually build the resources to which you communicate with the resource holders and say, listen, this is why you need to fund this, right? And then the fourth, I think, is around how you shift norms. I'm going to use my power right now because I think it's important that I say this. The first global UN ministerial conference, right, on this issue of child protection happened in November 2024. Why did it take so long? And unless we have that level of global norm setting, it doesn't actually empower the grassroots. So the connection between global norms and what happens at the grassroots needs to be strengthened, and I think philanthropy has a very important role to play there, right? That's why systems change happens. So we have SDG 16.2, right? Eliminate violence against children by 2030. We know that's not going to happen. I sit on the board of an organization that tracks the progress on gender equality across 14 of the 17 SDGs. It's going to take another 97 years, according to that index, for women to achieve gender equality. No such index exists for children. So unless philanthropy and other resource seekers start to advocate for that kind of measurement, you do not have the power to advocate for building the evidence, to shift the norms, shift the practices, and change narratives so that we can achieve our goals. There is an interconnectedness to the system, and it really sits at the heart of analyzing how power works. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna, because clearly log frames that we in the social sector swear by to create the monitoring and evaluation frameworks, how many of us know and question that they were made during the Vietnam War for the US Army to shift resources from, and the questions they asked in the log frame was, kitne logon ko mara, how many people you killed, how brutally you killed them, and we're using the same frameworks in the social sector today because USAID thought it was valid enough, and then the trickle down happened. Sorry, I'll repeat that. The log frames are a tool to measure input, output, outcome, resources. You know, जो NGOs चलाते हैं वो अक्सर जानते हैं कि फंडर सारी चीज़ें हमसे लॉग फ्रेम में मॉनिटरिंग इवैल्यूएशन करके मांगते हैं, बट हम में से कितने लोग ये सवाल पूछते हैं कि the log frames were designed by the US Army during the Vietnam War to really measure how brutally they killed the enemy. And social work, which is anything but that, is being forced to use the same frameworks because one day USAID said that's how it should be. And then all the intermediaries who worked with USAID and brought that money in the country said that, hey, it should be the log frames. And we never said as a small Chotu NGO grassroots organization, because why? Because the corporates and the CSRs feel that grassroots organization, hey, you're just an implementation NGO. We know. When you're a vendor. Hriday dialogues and movements like Hriday dialogues also want to undo that notion that Chotu NGOs, grassroots NGOs, are not implementation or vendor partners. It was, as Polina said, they are the closest to the problem, so they bloody well know the solution that will work the best. So at 5:01, we close the panel.